witness that we would make an offer of proof would be Sergeant Langley, which would be, we would suggest, especially significant given my colleague's redirect examination of Detective Sipe, because in addition to the things I mentioned in just a minute, as you know, Sergeant Langley was the sergeant in charge of this operation on January 18th, and my colleague asked Detective Sipe concerning Sergeant Langley if he had a gun, and did he use it, and if he didn't use it, why didn't he use it? And Sergeant Langley will tell you, yes, he did have a gun, and yes, he was there, and he will tell you why he didn't use it, because he was standing behind Officer Brailsford, and he perceived the same threat that Officer Brailsford perceived, and he had his weapon out. He had a pistol. I'm sorry, I forgot the make of it, but he believed and would so testify that he did not discharge his pistol because he believed that he might shoot and hit Officer Brailsford because he was standing behind him as Officer Brailsford was kneeling in front of him, and that he would believe, and he would testify that that was why he did not discharge his weapon. He would answer those questions that my colleague thought were so relevant in her direct examination of Detective Sipe. So obviously I would assume my colleague would think that his testimony would be very relevant as well as I do. He would also testify and answer the other questions that were raised concerning why he did certain things, why he felt it was proper to act on the and conduct his investigation in the manner that he conducted it. He would tell you exactly why he did what he did and why he did it. He would tell you that he believed that individual was not compliant. He would tell you that he came to the scene, he spoke to the manager, he was informed that there were 2 guests that came from the pool area telling him that there was a gun being pointed at them. He would tell you that he had sent an employee upstairs who confirmed that Shaver was in the room with a rifle, and that therefore he knew that they were up there in the room with a rifle. He would tell you, he would testify that he had no idea whether there were other guns in the room or not. He would tell you that in his training and in his experience, which is some 3 decades, that there's a rule, if there's a rule, that there's a rule, if there's one gun, there's more. He would testify that Officer Brailsford and Officer Elmore was assigned the lethal force position and that that was their job. He would testify that, in his opinion, with his experience, that Officer Brailsford did nothing inappropriate during the time that he was up there exercising his duty. He would testify that Officer Brailsford did his job, he did his assignment, and he protected the team and did what he was supposed to do. He would testify that when Schaefer made the movement that he did with his right hand going back, that it was a classic draw position, meaning that it appeared that he was drawing a weapon or a gun. He would testify that at the time he had a weapon in his hand and that his thumb was on the selector switch. He would testify that at the time, and that this is his training, that you cannot wait to see what Schaefer would pull out from his waistband, because if you do, you'll be dead, and that this is how the Mesa police are trained. So that's what Sergeant Langley would testify to. Officer Dohm would testify that he was there and that he believed that the actions of Officer Brailsford were correct in response to what he did, that he acted compliant with his training, and that he did exactly what he was trained to do, and that he would testify that under all of the circumstances that were present at that day, and all of the actions of Mr. Schaefer, that Officer Brailsford was totally justified in his actions that day. Officer Jeff Jacobs would testify that he has been a police officer for over 20 years. He is the Mesa police officer that trained Officer Brailsford. He has had a number of years as a firearms instructor and as a use of deadly force instructor. He is a member of the ASPOST Subject Matter Expert Committee on Firearms for a number of years. He's the lead instructor at the Mesa Police Academy, has been for a number of years. He has taught a number of firearms instructor courses, and he has helped organize a regional firearms instructor schools at Scottsdale as well. In other words, he teaches police at the Mesa Police Department, has taught them for a great number of years. He was at the scene that night, and he also has viewed the videos that the court has viewed. So not only did he train Officer Brailsford, but he has viewed the same video that Officer Brailsford has viewed. And he would testify that if I were to ask him the question, was Brailsford's actions in firing at Schaefer consistent with the way Brailsford was trained to react to a suspect making a movement of the sort Schaefer made toward his waistband in circumstances such as this, he would say that that's how he trained Officer Brailsford. And when I say in the circumstances such as this, he would tell you all of the circumstances that are present in that video. In other words, Officer Jacobs, as a training officer, says you've got to take all of the circumstances into consideration, the totality of the circumstances. A person in a motel room, that the information that these officers had, a person in a motel room pointing a gun out their window, that the person refuses to respond to repeated police commands to come out of the room. The man comes out, says he can follow commands, and says he's not drunk. That the man's demeanor is somewhat cooperative, somewhat non-cooperative, and is possibly crying. And he puts in there, of course, that the man says, please don't shoot me. The man is told if he puts his hand behind him again, he will be shot. That the man is crawling on his hands, his knees toward the police. That the man reaches again with his right hand behind his back and his waistband. Officer Jacobs would testify that Brailsford was trained in the kinds of places suspects can and do conceal handguns. Jacobs would testify that Schaefer's motion when he reached behind his back quickly with his right hand towards his right waistband, that it was consistent with and in fact looked just like the movement of a man reaching for a concealed handgun in that location. He would testify that officers are taught that you cannot wait to see what is coming out of a suspect's hand before you can react to that. And Officer Jacobs would testify about the principle of action versus reaction. And he would testify that Officer Brailsford was taught that principle and what that principle means to an officer, to a police officer. He would also testify about certain videos that Officer Brailsford was shown during his training. There are shown different videos, actual videos of police officers that have been taken with different cameras from police cars, from Axon videos that have happened in the field where police officers have confronted different suspects that have been armed and have not been armed, where they've made different types of actions, and how they are trained to react in situations such as this, where suspects have been compliant, non-compliant, have been friendly, not friendly, and where officers have responded and not been responsive and have been shot, and some officers have been killed. And then finally, for my offer of proof, I would have Manuel Capelson, who I indicated this morning is an expert in the area of use of force. He has 35 years. For 35 years, Your Honor, he's instructed law enforcement officers throughout the United States, and for over 30 years he has trained and certified instructors to teach law enforcement officers throughout the United States in firearms tactics and use of force. So for an example, he did Officer Jacobs' job, and he taught officers like Officer Jacobs to do his job. Actually, in Arizona, he has taught several annual training conferences of the International Association of Law Enforcement Firearms Instructors, hosted by the Mesa Police Department, and has hosted one by the Phoenix Police Department, and he has taught 4 courses at the Phoenix Regional Police Academy and at the annual conference of the Arizona Law Enforcement Firearms Instructors. He's also a licensed attorney, has a law practice in Pennsylvania. He's worked as a reserve deputy sheriff for 19 years, and he's been qualified and testified as an expert in state and federal courts throughout the United States since 1984, over 60 times at trial, and he's testified before the subcommittees of both houses of Congress. He's testified before grand juries and at legislative committees. He's been employed by state, city, and federal governments. He's been employed by prosecutors, and he's been employed by defense lawyers such as myself. In preparation for his testimony, he's reviewed the video, police records, witness statements, state statutes. He and I visited the scene at the La Quinta Inn. He's reviewed the discovery in this case, and he spoke with Mr. Brailsford about his training with the Mesa Police Department. He would testify that in his expert opinion, this was a high-risk incident and was treated by the Mesa Police Department as such. That Officer Brailsford was assigned a position as a cover officer. That a cover officer's duty is to remain alert and be prepared to instantly use deadly force in the event a deadly threat itself. That it was reasonable and keeping with law enforcement training for the police to treat Mr. Shaver as someone armed with a deadly weapon until they could determine otherwise. That the police actions in keeping Shaver that the police actions in ordering Shaver to lie down on the floor, ordering him to cross his ankles, ordering him to raise his hands in the air, and ordering him to crawl forward with his ankles crossed and his hands raised, were all based on the presumed likelihood that he might be armed. That when Shaver lowered his hands behind his back, that could be consistent with reaching for a weapon, or with what is called a security check, or a weapon carried in his waistband or behind his back. That Shaver was told repeatedly that the police would view any further reaching behind his back as a deadly threat that could result in his being shot. That when Shaver suddenly and rapidly and without warning moved his right hand to an area behind his back that was out of view of Officer Brailsford, the officer's training in standard police training throughout the country was viewed that as an immediate deadly threat. The area toward which Shaver reached is an area where suspects regularly conceal and carry handguns, and police know this. That Shaver's movements in reaching toward that area was consistent with and looked just like the movement of a person drawing a handgun from that part of the body. That due to the tactical principle of action versus reaction, an officer in Brailsford position cannot wait to identify what is coming forward in the suspect's hands or hand before firing, because if the officer does, if he does this, he cannot possibly respond quickly enough to keep the suspect from firing one or more shots before the officer can act defensively. That police throughout the country, including Arizona and including Officer Brailsford, are trained in this principle of action versus reaction. That he will explain and demonstrate why officers are taught that an officer cannot wait to identify what is in the suspect's hand before he fires. That in the circumstances of this incident, including the proximity and number of individuals in the hallway, the risk involved in allowing Shaver to complete his movement was unacceptably high. That pursuant to a principle of subject control, sometimes known as cooperative disadvantage, an officer in Brailsford position should not hesitate to fire because the suspect says, "Don't shoot me," or appears to be crying, or appears to be cooperative, when the suspect then makes a movement that appears to be a deadly attack. That Officer Brailsford was trained to be alert to the possibility of this ploy by a suspect, including being shown the Flagstaff officer involved shooting video. That Officer Brailsford's action in firing was consistent with nationally accepted standards of police training in the use of force and with Officer Brailsford's training. That's my offer.
Thank you, Mr. Marins. Court has considered the defendant's offer of proof. I do note, and this is citing State versus Jones, ex rel County of Maricopa. The citation is 198, Arizona 18. It really affirms the concept that the purpose of a preliminary hearing is to determine whether probable cause exists to hold the person charged with the crime to answer the alleged charge, not to decide the guilt of the accused. So the purpose of today is to not to determine whether or not Mr. Brailsford is guilty of the charge, but only to decide whether or not there is enough evidence to hold him to answer for the charge. The court, after hearing the defendant's offer of proof, is obligated to determine whether or not that offer of proof would be insufficient to rebut the finding of probable cause. The facts in this case are a little bit unique because the issue isn't whether or not the defendant caused the death of the victim. There is no dispute that he caused the death of the victim. The question is really his state of mind and whether or not there is any legal justification to his actions. So the question for the court is, would any of those witnesses' testimony rebut the existence of probable cause that the defendant be held to answer for the charge? The court finds that as to 3 of the 4 witnesses, the evidence would be insufficient to rebut the finding of probable cause. As to Sergeant Langley, I will allow the defense to put on that witness as an offer of proof. So, Mr. Marins, are you prepared to proceed at this time?
I am.
All right, you may call your witness. Sir, please come forward and approach the clerk. She'll administer the oath to you. My name is Charles J. Langley. Last name is spelled L-A-N-G-L-E-Y.
Walked in there. You swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes, I do. Sir, if you'll please take a walk around the court reporter up that ramp and have a seat on the witness stand to my left.
I know, I think he was here this morning. I'll ask him. State your name, please.
My name is Charles J. Langley.
Have you been in the courtroom during any of the testimony?
No, I have not.
Okay, thank you. All right. You were previously employed by whom?
I was previously employed by the Mesa Police Department.
But you have since retired?
Yes, I have.
Okay. Would you please give us some of your background? No, would you please give us all of your background, law enforcement background, please?
Well, I was a law enforcement officer for, I believe, approximately 28 years. I was first sworn in as a federal officer, I believe it was around 1989. I served on the border in the Southwest Division. Specifically, my duty station was Nogales, Arizona. I served there from 1989 until 1994. I had a variety of assignments there. Mostly I dealt with smuggling, dealt with narcotics interdiction, human smuggling interdiction, weapons smuggling, and stolen property and money being smuggled southbound. I did a prostitution detail where they were smuggling women north in order to be utilized as prostitutes. I served on a warrant detail where my duty was to identify and apprehend fugitives or attempting to re-enter the United States or to go southbound into Mexico. Did an extensive detail where I was assigned a steroid interdiction. For a short period of time, I was assigned into Tucson International Airport on a temporary detail where I was assigned to interdict money being transported into the United States through the airlines. This is a brief rundown. My training there was I originally attended the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia. And then I, of course, received service training, while I was a federal officer during the period of my service. In 1994, I transitioned to the Mesa Police Department. Served in the Mesa Police Department from 1994 until this year, and until the 21st of last month.
On January 18th of 2016, did you receive a call from the La Quinta Inn? Yes,
I did.
Did you tell the court about that call?
I was assigned as a patrol sergeant. The emergency traffic call came out of an individual with a rifle, pointing the rifle out of a fifth floor hotel room at the La Quinta Inn.
And what did you do in response to that call, sir?
Responded there, lights and siren. When I arrived, Officer Gomez was there, and there was also an adult female that was outside that identified herself to me as being a manager, I believe. She stated to me that two of her guests and an employee had stated that there was a subject with a rifle in room 502, as I recall, and that the two guests stated he had been pointing the rifle out the window. They were by the pool area, which was just south, on the south side of the building.
And what did you do next in response to that information?
Well, I realized at that point I had a hotel very much occupied by civilians, both by staff and by guests. I also had traffic on a very busy thoroughfare, which was Superstition Springs, that was on the south side of that building. And I had a parking lot, which had traffic in it, and I had restaurants that were also in that area too, that were going to be occupied by civilians. At that time, I decided to form an immediate action team and organize that and responded to the 5th floor of the La Quinta.
What type of threat did you perceive this to be? What level?
Well, this is 2016 in the United States. You know, we have had a variety of active shooters. We've also had people that have gone into public places, as we all know, and have engaged civilians as targets. So I was concerned not only with people on the exterior of the building, because I could possibly had somebody armed with a long gun on the 5th floor, which would be a perfect vantage point in order to, you know, shoot innocent people below the building and in the parking lot area and traffic going by. But I also realized that if or they did exit the room that they're supposedly in, then I had a variety of targets that are potentially in the occupied hotel rooms and, of course, people in the hallway, people throughout the 5 floors of La Quinta, including staff.
What did you do then?
Formed the immediate action team with the officers that were there and were available. Had the brief conversation with the manager to identify that, yes, we had a weapon involved. It was on the 5th floor of La Quinta, identified the room. 3 civilian witnesses at that point is what I was told we had. I realized that the elevator that was immediately the closest to that room would probably open up right in front of that doorway of that room, which I did not believe was going to be very safe for an immediate action team to go up that way. I wanted to use an elevator because I wanted to get up there as quickly as possible. So posted an officer on that side, which I believe is the east side of La Quinta, in order to secure that entry and exit way, and took the rest of the team in the west side elevator to the 5th floor of the La Quinta.
Can you tell us who was the team? Do you recall?
I had Officer Cochran with me, Officer Doan, Officer Gomez, and Officer Brailsford, and Officer Elmore.
And who were Officer Elmore and Officer Brailsford?
Officer Elmore and Officer Brailsford had their AR-15s with them. I assigned them as the lethal coverage for the team.
And what does that mean? What type of an assignment was that?
That was to protect the team as we moved and when we took position.
And what would happen next?
When we went up to the 5th floor, the doorway opened. We were at the opposite end of the hallway of a rather large building. The hallway extended all the way from the farthest west side of the building to the farthest east side. We had to go from the west side over to the east side. The geography was unusual because it was not a typical hallway where the doors opened directly into the hall. They were inset, and I would approximate it at a 45-degree angle within that inset. So in other words, if a door opened, we really weren't going to be able to see if it was open or closed. The time I organized the team with the limited resources we had, put one half on the north side of the hallway and the other half with me on the south side of the hallway. What I wanted to do was, because we had people occupied in that room, in their rooms, and I was concerned that people would start coming out of the rooms and could be potential targets if they were in the hallway walking. So I wanted to position the team so that we could put ourselves between the threat that was room 502 and potentially anybody that would come out of their hotel rooms.
And so how did you so position yourselves?
Did a stack where I had half the team on the south side, the other half on the north side, and we went down the hallway until we were able to take alcoves on the north and the south side of the hallway I believe it's to the immediate west of the target room.
All right, what did you do next?
At that time, it was just very, what I wanted to do was I wanted to see if they would respond. Wanted to do our best to secure, make sure everybody was safe. So we started making verbal commands to see if I could establish some type of communication and cooperation. Gave verbal commands and received no response.
What happened next?
At that time, I sent Officer Cochran downstairs to the lobby in order to use the in-house phone in order to communicate with room 502. Officer Cochran went down there. I also realized that having a little more chance to look at the rooms, that it would be advantageous to have a key card in case we need to have it for ourselves or to pass it off to another team. That's normal protocol. So I asked for Officer Gomez to also go down so he could immediately get a key card that could be coded for the room and to return with it.
And then what happened?
Officer Cochran communicated to me that he had spoken to an occupant in room 502, and he had, while this is going, actually, sorry, I had to backtrack. Before I sent the officers down, I could hear voices inside the room. When I was giving the verbal commands, I could hear voices. I could hear a female voice and possibly, and I wasn't sure whether it was two male voices. So I had asked Officer Cochran to ask the female to come out first because I knew the female wouldn't match the description of a possible suspect. So that's what I did at that point. Officer Cochran communicated to me via radio that he had made contact and that he had asked for the female to come out first.
Then what happened?
Well, we all had our earpieces. I heard this. Okay, acknowledge the fact that that the female was going to come out. Heard a door open, and a female came out and a male came out almost immediately behind her, which was not what the instructions were that had been given to them. So that took me somewhat by surprise because it was a very simple instruction. You know, female comes out first. Female and the male come out, which provided some difficulty because we were expecting in a narrow hallway in limited space to be dealing with one person and then to potentially call out any more. Instead, we're dealing with two. So I instructed them to lay down and prone out on the floor with their arms extended out in front of them, hands extended out in front of them, and to cross their legs.
And then what happened?
I relayed those instructions, and the female cooperated, the male cooperated. I had to reinforce the command, be very specific, that if they made any movements, that I would could be perceived as a threat. The female cooperated. As I recall, I had to give some more specific instructions to the male. But I got them both proned out, hands out in front of them, legs crossed, then gave the female instructions that to come up, push herself up to a kneeling position, put her hands straight up in the air, and crawl towards us on her knees.
And did you have the female then crawl towards you?
Yes.
Detective Sipe has told us he'd never seen or rarely seen this type of protocol. Why did you use this type of protocol?
Well, the geography, as I mentioned before, provides some difficulties, and the fact that they didn't come out the way they've been instructed to. Instead of dealing with one person, I now had two people out. One was potentially a suspect who could be armed, and I didn't know if I had anybody else still inside that hotel room. If I had asked them, say, for instance, to stand up and to walk towards me, what it would have done then is it would have potentially blocked the view of the doorway to that room. In other words, we wouldn't be able to see above them if anybody else came out behind them.
What did you know about guns and how many more guns, if any, were in the room?
From the information that we had at that time, I believe that there was a rifle in play. From my experience in training, if there's one weapon involved, there is always a strong likelihood that there is another or more.
And what did you know, if anything, about whether the suspects had any weapons on them? at this time?
Didn't know whether they had weapons or not when they came out.
So what did the female do?
The female followed instructions. She pushed herself up to the kneeling position, her hands straight up. Very simplistic. She came towards us. We had the two officers that were assigned to do handcuffing, just grab her, handcuff her, and pull her past us and secure her.
And at this time, or during this time, what is Officer Brailsford's job?
Officer Brailsford's job and Officer Elmore's job is specifically not to be concerned about the handcuffing, what's going on there. They are to provide protection for the team because when we're doing these interactions, we're vulnerable.
What type of protection?
They were to provide, they were providing lethal coverage protection, and also Officer Doan at that time also had his taser out, so he had less lethal being employed also.
And where, okay, now the female is now taken into custody or is handcuffed, and she's where?
She's, when in these circumstances, I actually will usually not turn my head. I asked if she was secure. The officers behind me that were responsible for handcuffing, secure her. They verbally affirmed to me that she was secure and she was no longer in play.
Where, okay, so you can't really see her, but
She's behind us.
So she's right near you.
Correct.
All right, what happens next?
Start giving verbal commands to the gentleman. I wanted to keep things as simple as possible, and also he already had a template, a role model of instructions that have been given to the female. Try to give those instructions to him so that it would be the same. Instructed him to come up to his knees and put his hands up in the air. He came up to his knees, and as I recall, he started to put both hands behind his back.
And what did that tell you? What did you take that to mean?
I took that as
How did you feel about that?
One, I knew that he was not following instructions, and there was a possibility that he may have been trying to bring a weapon into play.
Detective Sipe told us earlier that it looked to him like he was putting his hands behind his back to be handcuffed. Is that how you perceived it?
No. Number one, he was not in proximity to us to be handcuffed, so I don't know why. No, I can't put myself into his mind, so I don't know why he would think that that would be an appropriate place for him to come up to put his hands behind his back for handcuffing. Also, that didn't follow the instructions that I had given him.
What did you perceive that action to be?
At that point, realized maybe he just doesn't understand. We had distance at that time, so I felt that he had made a mistake. Right? So I reaffirmed the verbal instructions to him. As I recall, he affirmed that he understood. Told them that he was to keep his hands up in the air and start crawling towards us.
And what happened next?
He started crawling towards us, and he's crawling towards us. We're watching him. Officer Brailsford was in a kneeling position directly to my front. Officer Elmore was to my left on the north side. As the gentleman crawled towards us, he comes up and he abruptly starts putting his right hand behind him, almost like in what I thought was a drawing position, like he was drawing a weapon.
And what did you do?
At that time, my instinct was, it just reverberated in my brain. I said, I was thinking.
I'm sorry, what?
It was his instinct, just experience, training. I looked at him and I just thought, gun. I remember that at that point, I thought that we were going to get shot. I thought I was going to get shot. I thought, I was yelling at him. I had my rifle, pistol grip of my rifle was in my right hand. Barrel was pointed down because I was directly behind Officer Brailsford, who was kneeling. I'm thinking to myself, gun. I'm starting to yell. My thumb is on the selector switch of my rifle, and I'm starting to pull my rifle up and manipulate the selector switch when I realized, and this is all happening I guess in thousandths of a second, that I can't make the shot because Officer Brailsford is directly in front of me.
Why?
Problem is, Officer Brailsford is kneeling in front of me. In order to make the shot, I'd have to bring up my barrel up over his head, lean forward and punch forward, get my barrel past his head, so that if he did come up, I didn't shoot him in the back of the head. Also, I have a short-barreled rifle, and at that proximity, just the muzzle blast could have killed or seriously injured him. So I couldn't make the shot.
And is that the only reason you didn't?
Yes, otherwise I would have shot.
And then what happened?
I'm yelling, I'm got my thumb on my selector switch for my rifle, I'm pulling up. Officer Brailsford engages him. The gentleman goes down. At that time, knew that the gentleman was down. I still had a hallway that the team had to clear and a room that I wanted to move on and see if we could at least secure the doorway of that.
Is what Officer Brailsford did appropriate?
I believed at the time, and I believe now, that he was protecting the team. I mean, that was his job, was to make sure that we weren't killed or seriously injured.
Can I have a minute, Your Honor? Thank you, Sergeant. That's all I have.
Mr. Merritt, Mr. Charbel, cross-examination.
Good afternoon, sir. All right, so you were in law enforcement altogether 28 years before you retired from Mesa?
Approximately. I never.
Right, give or take.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me ask you this in general. How many times did you read the police reports in your supplement before today?
I read the police report, I believe, about twice, and I went over my supplement probably about 5 times.
When you say the police report, you mean like the entirety of the police?
Yes.
When did you do that?
I did it while I was outside waiting.
Just today?
Yeah.
All right. And your supplement, how many times did you read that? Sorry.
About 5 or 6 times.
All right. Was that today as well?
Yes.
Okay. What about the video, the Axon body camera video?
I reviewed that one time,
Okay. When was that?
about a week ago.
All right. And did you watch both Officer Doan and Mr. Brailsford's, or only Mr. Brailsford?
Only Officer Brailsford's.
Okay. So you do not, do you know what was on Officer Doan's, or which
No, I do not.
angles? Okay, so you don't know any of that. Okay. And you did all this, obviously, since you read the reports before you came in here in preparation for today's testimony. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right. So your recollection, is that based pretty much on what came up back in your mind as you read your report and your supplements and the report?
Some of it, yes.
Okay. And your report in this case was, let's see, 1 and a little bit less than a half pages, correct?
Yes.
All right. And this was a very active situation, correct?
Correct.
A lot of stuff happened, right?
I was there for part of it, I should say.
Okay. And you are taught in the academy. I know that was probably a long time ago for you, but you are taught to, when you write a supplement, to write it as thoroughly as possible, right? Like as much information as you can in there?
Yes, in a supplement, and also know that I'm going to be available for interviews afterwards.
Right, so, but a supplement, let's say this case was, it's gonna go to trial, a case is gonna go to trial in 5 years, you're not expected to remember everything, is that right?
That's correct.
And that's the reason why you write a police report, right?
Correct.
Okay, and in this case, you have, of course, the addition of the Axon body camera video to kind of remind you of what happened, right?
Correct.
Okay. But not everything is on the video, right?
I'm sorry, ma'am.
Not everything is on that Axon body camera video,
No,
right?
ma'am.
Okay. Now, when you arrived at this situation, right, already in the back of your mind, you're thinking, hey, we've had a lot of active shooters and engaged civilians, as you called them, so you were on heightened alert because of that. Is that right?
Not, how should I explain it? That in itself was just one possibility, but anytime you're dealing with the report confirmed by multiple witnesses that you have a subject with a gun, about equitable.
As you told defense counsel, what you were thinking, right, when you appeared there is that we have had a lot of active shooters who have engaged civilians. So that was in the back of your mind, correct?
Oh, the possibility was, yes.
Right. So you already came in kind of thinking that that could be a possibility, right?
Amongst several, yes.
Okay. Even though there were nobody had said that this individual pointed a rifle at particular people. Is that right?
At that point, ma'am, like I said, what I had was suspect pointing a weapon out the window and 3 civilians confirming that he had pointed the weapon out the window. That's what I had.
All right. And actually, one of the civilians didn't see anything. She was told that by the other 2.
I can only go with limited information I'm given at the time.
Okay. In your report, it says, the manager said the suspect had been seen pointing a rifle by 2 guests. So only 2 people had seen him point a rifle, correct?
This is from recollection, but I think she mentioned to me that an employee had gone up there and seen a rifle also in the room.
Is that right? That's not in your report anywhere.
I think I did mention it when I arrived.
Oh, let me, exhibit number 8.
Thank you, ma'am.
Know when you find that.
Yes, you're absolutely correct, ma'am. I apologize for that.
All right, so there were no calls about anybody else having seen this
Correct,
rifle? Right?
yes, too.
Okay. So there were 2 individuals who said a man was pointing a rifle out the window, right?
Yes.
All right, and so when you were downstairs and speaking with the manager, did the manager inform you that they knew this person, the person in that room, what his name was?
The information I gathered, and it may have been related to another officer there, was that he was a guest. There was a guest.
All right, and had you been told that there were 3 people in that room initially?
And this is just from recollection. He said there might have been more than 1 person in the room.
Okay. Is it possible that the manager had told you there were actually 3 people, 2 men and a female?
I do not recall that.
Okay, and that, it would have been easier to recall it if it was in your report though, correct?
Yes.
Okay, all right, so you, now you think, maybe we think, that you knew there were 3 people there. Did the individual, this manager, whose name I don't believe you even mentioned in here, but anyway, did she tell you that the occupant of room 502, Mr. Shaver, was intoxicated or had seemed to be intoxicated? Okay. You don't remember anybody relaying that information to you?
No.
Okay. And so, but when you had him come out of the room, you asked those 2 people if they were intoxicated. Why did you do that if you didn't have reason to believe that they had been drinking?
And that's a very good question. It was simply because when they came out, I wanted to understand, what their mental state was at the time. And it's not unusual for them to be intoxicated or under the influence. So I was simply trying to be cautious and ask them.
Okay. And do you ask that of everybody when,
Very, very frequently in these
Okay.
situations. I mean,
Not-
not all, actually, not all the time, but I
Not
did in
always.
circumstances.
All right. But wouldn't it have made more sense if you had been told that they had been drinking for you to immediately ask, hey, are you guys intoxicated by any chance?
Well, as you recall, you just mentioned I did ask them and I received the answer no.
Okay. So you had some suspicion that possibly they could have been.
I didn't have anything that I had seen. I was just asking just to make sure.
Okay. So you do ask that of everybody?
No,
Okay. But you don't know why you asked in this situation?
no.
All right. So now you're thinking this could have been an active shooter, even though nobody fired,
It was a possibility
Right.
that it could develop into that. I wanted to be cautious.
right, even though nobody fired any weapons?
Correct.
Or pointed them at anybody in particular?
Correct.
Or made threats toward anybody?
Correct.
Right? And nobody else besides the two individuals downstairs in the spa who had seen this from 4 floors away, right? Because it was on the 5th floor.
Correct.
Did you ask those two individuals if they had been drinking?
No, I did not have contact
Okay.
with them.
So you didn't ask them about that. You obviously, you took it seriously. You thought, oh, these people must be correct. There must be a guy pointing a rifle out the window, correct?
I believe so.
Right, even though you can't really point a rifle out the window because there was a screen in the window, but you didn't question what they had to say, right?
I didn't have the opportunity to do so.
Okay, because you did not interview them, or nobody interviewed them thoroughly,
Well,
a little bit.
In this situation, when you had the opportunity, but first we wanted to secure, to make sure it wasn't occurring, that
Right.
nobody was going to be hurt.
Okay, so while you were downstairs though, nobody called upstairs to room 502 to say, hey, is there a weapon out there by any chance? We got a call that there was, is everybody okay? There was a weapon? Nothing?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay, so you didn't have anybody call down from downstairs?
Once we were upstairs.
Right, but you didn't have them call down from downstairs to ascertain if there was a weapon in the room, if anybody was in danger in the room, any of that? No?
Ma'am, I don't know if it would be a very
Well, it's a
good
yes or
idea to
no
follow
answer.
up.
Did you?
Hold on. Let him finish and then you
Oh, sure.
go.
If there is a possibility of weapon, it is not a very, in my mind, a safe practice to call up and say, by the way, it's the police. We have people saying that you may have been pointing a rifle out the window of your hotel room. Do you have a rifle? And is it okay if we come and check? I'd rather be in position to protect people rather than to give forewarning before we've made it all the way up there to the 5th floor.
Right, only you didn't ascertain that anyone was necessarily in danger because the call wasn't that anybody was pointing a rifle at someone or making threats towards anyone, correct?
In my mind, I believed that there was a rifle in play on the 5th floor.
Okay.
And there was,
Now, Sergeant, you're going up to the 5th floor, already thinking that there is a weapon, a rifle, that all these people are in danger, right? And that you are there to protect everyone in the hotel room without knowing if there was, in fact, a rifle in there or whether someone was correct in that assumption or not. And that's a yes or no answer is what I require. If you can't answer it with that,
Ma'am.
I'll let it go.
in my profession, you could never be 100% positive of anything until usually after the fact.
Okay, so now you go upstairs with what you called an organized team, but with limited resources. What limited resources are those? How were you limited?
Simply because, we went up with the people that we had available at the time in order to secure the floor. And of course, we had other resources responding after the fact.
All right, so you had 6 people, including yourself, correct?
Correct.
All right, and you consider those limited resources against one person with a rifle?
The reason I say that in a perfect world, you'd have everything available to you, but unfortunately you don't. You have the people that are assigned to the district at that time.
Okay, so, well, the way you explain it then, you are always going to be with limited resources, correct? Because it's not a perfect world.
It is not a perfect world,
Okay.
that's correct.
So technically, you came with the resources that you would be ordinarily allowed. You weren't limited by anything, right?
Limited by the number of officers available.
And then you also had a canine officer, and I mean the canine part, right? Like the dog was downstairs.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, and the dog was not brought in, even though a dog could sometimes diffuse a situation, or you can sick them on the person or what have you, right?
The decision on whether the canine is suitable to be deployed is up to the canine officer.
Okay. But you did not suggest that the canine officer bring his...
I know that from my experience that if the canine was deployable, that the officer would have brought the canine.
Okay. So you sent, so when you came out of the elevator, everybody took their positions, correct? You started screaming, right, towards, in the direction of that room, right, 502?
I would describe it as yelling very loudly to make sure that they heard me.
Okay, so you were yelling very, very loudly, right? Hoping that they're going to hear you or expecting them to hear you through the walls and the doors, even though you couldn't even see room 502, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, and you raised your voice a few times, right, understandably, to see if, you know, anybody would react, right?
Yes, ma'am.
There's no reaction from inside the room, correct?
Correct.
All right, so then you had an officer, Officer Cochran, go downstairs to call the room, correct?
Correct.
And then was he also supposed to get the key card?
No, that was Officer Gomez, ma'am.
All right, so you sent away 2 of your people downstairs, even though upstairs was this active, kind of threatening situation, correct?
At that point, what I still had was Officer Elmore, Officer Doan, Officer Brailsford, and myself.
All right, so how is that different from what I just asked?
No, I'm saying-
Hold on.
I was still, if they had come out, I could still order them back in or to lay down.
All right, so let me re-ask you the question, since I didn't really understand your answer. But the question was, even though you were in this active, maybe threatening situation, right? You're heightened alert, you sent 2 of the officers downstairs to get a key card and to make a call. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, good. All right, so when Officer Cochran went downstairs, what did you tell him to do when he made the call?
To call into the room, let them know it was the Mesa Police, and of course, I'm sorry, this is a recollection, and I don't know exactly what he said, but I asked them to let them know we're here and to have the female come out first.
All right, so even though a few moments ago you said it wasn't appropriate to announce that you were here, you actually did send the Officer Cochran downstairs to say, hey, it's the Mesa Police Department, I need you guys to come.
Right, but the previous thing, I took it that if we're already downstairs before we had gone upstairs.
And you didn't tell him what to say, right, Officer Cochran? Okay. And so Officer Cochran went upstairs, when he called, he said, is there a female in the room? Do you know that?
No.
No? Okay. You don't know where he would have gotten the information that there was only a female in the room?
I know that I did hear a female voice coming from the room, and he was with us upstairs, so I believe he may have heard that
Right.
female voice also.
And you testified earlier that you heard what you thought were 2 male voices, correct?
Possibly 2 males.
But you did not have Officer Cochran ask if there was another male in the room, correct? Only if there was...
I did not specifically instruct that, no.
Okay. So you did not tell him that you had heard 2, maybe 3 voices in the room?
Actually, I had a conversation, I'm not sure if it shows up on the tape. I think once again, this is recollection. I think I heard, maybe 3 people.
Okay. But you don't know if that Officer Cochran?
No, I cannot confirm that.
All right. So you weren't very specific with him. You just said, go downstairs and make sure these people
Correct.
come out. Okay. And that's because you assumed that they were defying directions, so to speak, to come out.
At that time, I believe that they were defying it. I think it may be a possibility that they were just didn't hear or weren't paying attention.
So they did not come out. So at that time then, did you start thinking perhaps they were uncooperative?
Not so much. Really, I just thought it was maybe they didn't hear, like I said, or were paying attention, and I also didn't know what was going on in the room. Overall, at this look at it, I'll just try another method of communicating.
Okay.
Because if they'd stay in there, it's not really too much of an issue.
So that was why you were going to try something else, and that's why you sent the 2 officers downstairs.
Yeah, and
Why didn't you have Officer Cochran ask for a card as well when he was down there? Why did you send two separate officers? I don't.
Because if Officer Cochran went down and maybe he ended up having a dialogue, it's the only way we could talk to him, maybe more advantageous. That way I'd hopefully have an officer quickly shuttle up and downstairs, get the key card, and I'd have that person back. And if it worked out, I'd have Officer Cochran still down there.
Okay. And at this point, was anybody's weapons drawn except for, well, anybody's actually? Let's just do that.
Let's see, we had the two